Well, trying to flex its muscles again, the United States want the world to go along with its demands, and this time it wants the world to boycott Iranian oil or be punished by Washington. Now, according to the Chinese authorities, Washington wants the world to listen to them based on their own domestic law, and that is simply not right. Well, join us right now for the news analysis coming up on this subject. I'm Marzieh Hashimi. Thanks so much for staying with us.
The U.S. is facing obstacles as it's struggling to impose unilateral sanctions on Iran over the nation's nuclear energy program. China has voiced its strong dissatisfaction and firm opposition to Washington's decision to impose sanctions on the Chinese company Zhuhai Zhenrong. China's foreign ministry has said the U.S. sanctions are not even in line with the content and the spirit of related resolutions on Iran adopted by the UN Security Council. Earlier, Japan, Washington's close ally in Eastern Asia, rejected U.S. calls for Tokyo to stop buying oil from Iran, the OPEC #2 oil exporter. Alongside the U.S., some of its European allies are making efforts to impose sanctions on Iranian oil. They have also had difficulties in getting on board other European countries as well as big companies. Russia, another veto-holding member of the UN Security Council, has also opposed imposing sanctions on Iranian oil. In Europe, Italy, and in Eastern Asia, South Korea have opposed the same sanctions. Iran has warned against sanctions, saying it will not allow a drop of oil to pass through the strategic Strait of Hormuz if sanctions are imposed on its oil sector. The opponents of sanctions on Iran's oil argue that embargoing the nation's oil sector will cause the prices of the commodity to skyrocket in world markets, thus dealing a heavy blow to the ailing global economy.
Well, I'd like to welcome my guest to the program from Washington, Webster Griffin Tarpley, author and journalist, and from New York, investigative journalist Thomas Lipscomb, and by phone from California, author of Guilt by Association, Jeff Gates. Thank you all for being with us, and welcome to the program. Well, let me start this off in Washington, Mr. Tarpley. Now, legally, let's look at the legality of all of this. How can the United States actually punish countries which decide to buy Iran's oil and pay via Iran's central bank? How do they make a domestic law and have it affect countries other than themselves internationally?
Well, the rather novel theory of the Obama administration is that you can carry out what would normally be called the secondary boycott. In other words, the United States says that the United States won't buy Iranian oil. Okay, but now the United States says that any country or central bank that buys Iranian oil will also be boycotted by the United States. So the bottom line is, if you deal with Iran, you can't have a financial presence inside the United States. So I would call this illegal. I would call it simply blackmail. It's a secondary boycott, and it's of dubious success, too, because that's the thing. We just had Secretary of the Treasury Geithner go on an arm-twisting tour of East Asia. And the big question is, will other countries go along with this? If you go, for example, to China and say to them, either you stop buying Iranian oil or you can't have any financial dealings with the United States, is that tenable? The general overview of the results of Geithner's tour is that China has said no, and they're very angry, as you just mentioned, about this, the case of this Zhuhai Zhenrong, where there's been a very angry response from Beijing. They may have reached their limit in terms of taking dictation from the U.S. Also, India, which buys a significant amount of Iranian oil, is also basically saying no. So China, India say no. Japan has been leaned on by Geithner. And in this case, the government is somewhat wishy-washy. It's a very weak government. However, since the atomic reactor incident of a year ago, Japan really needs to buy oil. So what will they do? And then you have South Korea, the ROK. What will they do? Those two are sort of up in the air. Certainly, if you tell people in Japan you've got to choose between China and the United States, there's a significant part of the Japanese economy that will say, well, we choose China. So it's very difficult. A country like Italy, Italy has been beaten up a lot lately by Standard & Poor's and others. They lost their Libyan oil for quite a while. They get about 20% of their or at least a significant part of their oil from Iran. Are they going to be able to say no to this? So there's a whole array of countries that are now being put on the spot by the U.S. with this strong arm, blackmail, secondary boycott approach, which simply shows that the people leading U.S. foreign policy, I would say, are imbeciles. They imagine that they have all of this power. When Geithner went to China, he basically had a whole series of non-negotiable demands, and I think they basically reacted with a great deal of rage.
We have different officials in the American government and other governments saying different things. We had now the U.S. Secretary of Defense regarding the sanctions and regarding Iran's nuclear program, basically saying that no, Iran is not trying to make nuclear weapons, or they don't have a nuclear weapons program. But yet at the same time, we have British Defense Secretary Philip Hammond saying that Tehran is definitely working on a nuclear weapons program, and this is why the sanctions. What is going on?
Well, what we have here is it's a buildup. I've been able to count 9 aggressive, warlike, unfriendly acts that the United States is carrying out against Iran, all on the pretext of an Iranian nuclear weapons program. And remember, the U.S. official opinion, the national intelligence estimate of the United States of about 4 years ago, says there is no Iranian nuclear weapons program. So officially, the official doctrine of the United States government is there is no such thing, but nevertheless we've got this hysteria that's being built up. So what do we have? We've got the war in Iraq winding down or wound down. We've got a war going on in Afghanistan, very close to Iraq. We've got an increase of U.S. naval presence in the Gulf, right? A new carrier battle group is on its way to the region. There's all kinds of warships in the Gulf on the other side of the world. U.S., of course, has bases in Kuwait, bases in Saudi Arabia. We've got these economic sanctions with this new dimension of the secondary boycott. We've got the U.S. sending spy drones over Iran. We've got cyber attacks. We've got things like the Stuxnet that have reportedly been introduced into Iranian scientific facilities. We've got the U.S. and the British and the Israelis backing terror groups, people like Jundullah, the Rigi organization. We've got separatist groups among the people in Arabistan, Akhvaz, or among the Kurds, among the Turkmen, among the Azeris, and these other ethnic groups. You've got a policy, obviously, of assassination of scientists. And we've got the most Republican presidential candidates are endorsing the idea that you should go around the world killing the scientists, not just of Iran, but of Russia as well. And then we've got these mysterious explosions that take place at Iran's nuclear facilities or research facilities. In other words, the ones that have to do with nuclear power reactors. So my count, 9 points of aggression. And this is unheard of. This is international anarchy. And of course, you'd expect the peace movement here in the United States to be up in arms. But unfortunately, the foundations that control the U.S. peace movement are all pro-Obama, so they've cut off the funding. So there's very little awareness here in the United States that we're drifting into this tremendous strategic emergency.
Okay, well, let me get Mr. Jeff Gates. Let me get Jeff Gates in on this, Mr. Tarpley. Let me turn to California. Now, Jeff, what about this? What our guest in Washington has just said, that even as far as, let's say, the liberals or those from different movements that usually talk about the American policies, for example, anti-war, but when dealing with this situation, they're not really putting that much pressure on Washington. It's as if they do not see what exactly the government is doing when they make these moves. Why is that the case?
I think both of our parties have been pretty thoroughly corrupted by the dominant lobby in Washington, which is the Israel lobby. Both parties have been thoroughly infiltrated along with our intelligence services. I strongly disagree with the speakers who want to blame this on the U.S. government. It is not our government doing this. It is a government within our government that has thoroughly corrupted our decision-making. We were taking to war in Iraq on false pretenses. There's a current issue, the current issue of foreign policy. Your viewers and listeners can look it up. It's called false flag. And it's clear the CIA, our intelligence agencies are outraged at what the Israelis have done. It appears that they've disguised themselves as CIA operatives to put together campaigns both in Pakistan and most likely in Iran that would then be blamed on us. That's why I call my latest book Guilt by Association. This is how you take very small numbers of pro-Israelis and leverage their impact worldwide, and how you induce us to war against our interest. Truman was warned against this by the Joint Chiefs in 1948. He called these people fanatics, said do not give them the appearance of legitimacy. Said they seek hegemony in the region. They will lure us into serial wars on their behalf. It's worked out precisely as predicted 64 years ago.
Well, let me turn back to Mr. Tarpley now. Now, with all of this, it seems to be escalating. Now, of course, Iran has said that if this continues and actually they try to not allow Iran to sell the oil, that they are able to block the Strait of Hormuz. Where are we going with all this, you think?
Well, the Strait of Hormuz, of course, is very, very vulnerable. I think from a sort of military technical point of view, people who say that the United States can keep that tanker traffic open, I think are whistling in the dark. Suppose we go back to 1988, right? There were some mines that were found in the Gulf, and a couple of tankers ran into these mines. That by itself was enough to drive up the insurance rates charged by people like Lloyd's of London. The insurance rates on these tankers that were going through the Gulf became so high that it became economically impossible, at least at that price of oil that you had in 1988, to keep the tanker traffic going. If you look at that long Iranian coast, because it's not just the straits, it's the whole Gulf, it's made to order for mines, for mine laying, which is a very effective, low-cost weapon. Traditionally, the United States Navy has not had a strong point in anti-mine warfare. It's not considered glamorous. Right now, you have the U.S. Navy trying to tell people that they're able to deal with the mines because they have specially trained dolphins that can go to the mines and somehow help blow them up. But I don't think there's
stay with
any
me,
doubt
Mr.
that it would
Tarpley.
bring
Let me get our guest from New York
to an end.
Sorry to interrupt you. Let me get our guest from New York in on this discussion, Mr. Thomas Lipscomb. The question that I was asking.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for being with us. Sorry about we had some technical issues. Now, sir, with the situation at this point, that there seems to be tension, obviously escalating. Where does that take us right now, with now the Iranians saying that they are quite capable of blocking the Strait of Hormuz, and now with the U.S. saying that they won't allow the Strait of Hormuz to be blocked? What is this bringing us to? What is the answer at this point?
Let's talk about it. I don't think there's an answer, but I've got a question. What if Iran reminds me a little bit right now of the dog barking at a car running down the road? What happens if the dog catches the car? I would think the dumbest thing in the world Iran could do would be to block the Straits of Hormuz and make any gesture of doing. The only thing dumber would be to threaten OPEC nations that if they increase oil production, there'll be ramifications from Iran. This is the wrong stance for Iran to make. Right now, Iran has a golden opportunity to negotiate with the Obama administration that may disappear at the end of this year to make some kind of settlement on this entire issue. The sanctions may or may not be blackmail, but they are effective. As you all know, in Tehran, you're facing 30% inflation right now, and it's going up. You have shortages of fuel, shortages of gasoline. It's beginning to bite. Someone is finally making the sanctions work. Let's get rid of that. It's only making things worse. And remember, all of Iran's oil production and its major shipping ports have easy access to U.S. naval forces in the Persian Gulf. This is a game nobody wants to play, and it seems to me, rather than think about where is it going to go, we should all be thinking about how do we turn this off. Remember, it's not just the United States' sanctions that's the problem. There are 4 UN sanctions against Iran right now. The EU has sanctions. Separate nations have individual sanctions. And that's just the present. The future, with fracking coming on board, means that in 10 years, the United States will be exporting oil, and so will places like Poland. The entire economy may be much more of $50 a barrel oil in 10 years than it is now. How will Iran chart its way into those waters? It won't have the same leverage. It needs to get the best position it can get right now and not to spend time threatening people.
Mr. Tarpley, your take. I saw you shaking your head with that. Your take on what our guest in New York has just said.
Well, the problem with negotiating is negotiation implies that you have a rational partner, and I'm afraid here in Washington you don't. There was an attempt not so long ago to have some kind of a negotiated solution, and this was shot down by Hillary Clinton, because Hillary Clinton is such a weak personality that she's always got to be the biggest warmonger in the room. Otherwise, she's afraid she won't be taken seriously. I think there are a couple of ways that this could be halted. The United States now says Iran getting a nuclear weapon is a red line. Well, I don't know where the nuclear weapon is, but so the U.S. has said what their red line is. Maybe others should say what their red line is. We have the Russian representative Rogozin at NATO who says that a U.S. attack on Iran would be a threat to Russian security. Why doesn't the Russian government state its red line? Maybe their red line is don't attack Iran. The Chinese government in the past has put out at least undercover back-channel messages to the United States saying, don't attack Pakistan, we'll treat that as an attack on China. Maybe the Chinese government should say to the United States, we have a red line too, and that may be don't attack Iran. Another thing is we have a presidential campaign going here. We have the candidate, Ron Paul, claims to be a great enemy of war. He's got a lot of attention right now. Why doesn't Congressman Paul submit articles of impeachment against Obama? That would get quite a bit of attention, given his votes in the recent primaries, and maybe that would call the attention of the American people to what's going on.
Okay, let me get Jeff Gates back in on this.
But that's something Ron Paul could do.
Okay, let me get Jeff Gates back in on this. What about that, Mr. Gates? Is it that might means right? Because it seems that, as our guest in Washington was talking about, the red lines, that it's the United States drawing the red lines, as if other countries do not have their own red lines. Your take on this?
Yeah, there's no saying in diplomacy, when you reach an impasse, you need to go back to key principles. Key principle is neither of us want to be at war with one another. We don't want to undermine our economies, that sort of thing. I think if you're trying to reach the impasse, you go to things like what Turkey has suggested, which they offered in May, and people are trying to bring this back into the mix again, the so-called P5+1, the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, plus Germany, were trying to get these negotiations up and going again, which may have been the rationale for the assassination, which would be traditional game theory warfare. You undermine negotiations. That's something the Israelis do routinely. But Turkey's offered about 1,200 kilos of medium-enriched uranium in exchange for modestly enriched uranium. Thereby, Iran would have what it says it needs for its medical isotopes. So you look for something like that addresses the shared interest of the parties. But right now, both, I think, Iran and the U.S. have played into traditional game theory warfare, where you've got the two sides pit against one another. And oddly enough, of course, this is now actually giving Iran the rationale to enrich. Iran cannot back down. Given the current political environment in the U.S. with a presidential election, Obama can't be perceived as wobbly on national security. So someone, hopefully a third party, that's the P5+1, and begin to inject some insanity into this. And,
well, let me just jump in here, Mr. Gates. Let me just jump in here, because we've been down that road before last year. We know that same suggestion came out of Turkey and that Iran agreed to it. And immediately right after that, the U.S. imposed more sanctions. So what makes it different this time around?
Well, because things have been ramped up. Again, if it's true that the Mossad, posing as CIA agents, did a mass murder in Pakistan, that undermined our relationships there. The terrorist group that they negotiated with, of course, are Sunni and very much anti-Iran, and are known to do murders inside Iran. So our intelligence operatives are apparently just outraged at this so-called ally trying to pull us into this war the same way they pulled us into Iraq. Very similar modus operandi.
Okay, well, let me get back to Mr. Lipscomb. What happens if China does not go with this and actually starts flexing its muscles, that they're tired of listening to Washington? What happens in this scenario, Mr. Lipscomb?
Well, I think you don't get to be tired of negotiating with anybody if you're acting in good faith. Whether Washington is missing the point or not, you keep negotiating. It's an ancient Persian principle. I'm surprised the Ahmadinejad government doesn't understand it. I thoroughly agree with Mr. Gates that the Turkish
I asked you about Beijing, actually. I asked you what happens if Beijing doesn't follow through.
Well, Beijing is going to, they're the carcass picker in this. They love this happening because Beijing would be perfectly happy to pick up all Iranian oil that's largely exported to the Far East, as you all know. They'd like to pick it all up for much lower prices, which they would be able to do in a buyer's marketplace like the one they might very well be working behind the scenes to create. Everybody's got their own interest in this matter. This is realpolitik at work.
Okay, and Mr. Tarpley, we're just about out of time. What will it take to resolve this issue?
Well, it would take either some growing awareness, an anti-war mass movement in the United States, which we don't seem to have at the present time, or it would take some rather decisive action by some of the other great powers in the world, by Russia, China, India, perhaps, Japan. If we could repudiate this policy of economic warfare, which does not succeed, I think that would be a step in the positive direction. Just in a technical point, if we had a pipeline from Iran through Pakistan into China that would deliver this oil, that would also, I think, be a step in the right direction. In other words, peaceful economic development is the way to avoid war, but unfortunately, it's precisely the United States is determined to block peaceful economic development. So
all right, I'm so sorry. I would love to continue this discussion. I'm sorry, but we are out of time. I'd like to thank you, Mr. Webster Griffith Tarpley, author and journalist from Washington, Thomas Lipscomb, investigative journalist from New York, and the author of Guilt by Association, Jeff Gates, by phone from California. Thank you so much for being with us, and thank you, viewers, for tuning in to Press TV's News Analysis. I'm Marzia Hashemi, signing out for myself and all the crew here in Tehran. Thank you, and goodbye.